Great to have everyone joining us. We'll just give a few minutes. It takes a wee while just for all our attendees to come on to the.
So Jamie, I should go off during this session.
Yeah, you could do actually, and
okay.
we'll come into the later bit. Maybe use Judith as well if you want to switch your video off just now.
Okay.
So.
Look forward to you guys. Okay.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
It's just a few people joining, so I'm just going to give us a wee minute there.
Okay.
We seem to be stabilising, so I think I'll make a start, given we're quite tight for time this morning, and people can join us as we come along. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Just now, I'm delighted that you could join us today. My name's Jamie Cook. I'm part of the organising committee for BN Congress 2021 here in Glasgow. And in my day job, I'm head of RSA Scotland and involved in the basic income discussions here in Scotland and elsewhere. And I can't believe that we're in the final day of our Congress. It seems incredibly strange to have spent this time planning, looking forward to this. I think we first bid for Congress about 2 years ago. And yet here we are hurtling towards the end, and yet still have some really fascinating opportunities ahead of us. So stick with us, keep getting involved in the discussions. There's still a lot to come today. And really excitingly, we can start to look ahead to next year. I'm delighted that this morning we're joined by the organising committee for BN Congress 2022, which will be taking place in Australia next year. And we're going to spend the first part of today's session hearing about some of the plans for that, some of the developments in Australia, the context that's there. It feels like it's a very exciting time for us to be connecting there. And I know I would publicly reiterate the support and enthusiasm the Scottish team have for working with and supporting our colleagues as we look ahead to Congress next year. In 2014, Glasgow was the host city for the Commonwealth Games. It was an incredible time in the city. Probably the best 2 weeks of weather I think we'd ever had. You felt the need to go apologise to visitors and point out to them that normally it's not as nice as it was at the time. And actually at the end of the 2014 Games, Glasgow handed over to the Gold Coast in Australia as the next host. It was a fantastic closing ceremony. Glasgow pulled out all of our best tropes and memes, whether that be statues with cones on their head, Tunnock's tea cakes, a local delicacy and height of culinary excellence, all of which we would have shown you had you been able to join us here in person. So our handover today is a little bit toned down, I suppose. We haven't quite managed to secure Kylie Minogue, who performed there. But I do want to, on behalf of the local organising committee, as I say, pass the baton, pass on our best wishes to the team from Australia for next year, and we very much look forward to taking part in what you have planned for us. So the first part of today's session, the team from Australia are going to talk us through, as I say, some of the ideas, the setting, the framing for next year, but also that context of what's been developing in Australia and some of the ideas we can start to look ahead towards exploring in more detail next year. And there'll be a chance to ask questions, reflections, and share your general enthusiasm for taking part in that Congress. Please use Hoover. You can ask your questions and put comments up in there, chat to other participants, and get in touch with the organisers as well. And then after we finish that part of the section, we have 2 Australian activists who have prepared presentations for us and ideas about how basic income is developing in Australia. We'll show those and give a space for questions, reflections on their ideas as well. So we'll come to that later on. But without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Professor Greg Marston, who's leading the Australian team. He'll introduce us to them and take us into this first part of this morning's session. So thanks, Greg, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Jamie, for that warm introduction and passing the baton for BN Congress. The first part, as Jamie said, is brought to you by the team that was going to present BN 2020 in 2020. But, you know, another number got in the way of that Congress, and that's 19 with the COVID in the front of it. And so well into the planning of that, we had to unfortunately pull the plug. And we were keen to learn, of course, in terms of how the conference has gone this year in the Congress, in terms of the online experience, because as Elise would have said earlier in the week, we're looking to do what we can in terms of a hybrid event. We're not sure what will happen with the Australian borders. Of course, there's lots of hesitation on the part of the government about opening up those borders. And there's also, of course, lots of other reasons as to why a hybrid conference makes sense in terms of sustainability. And that was one of the themes that we were looking at in the Congress in 2020, was thinking about the kind of the ecological crisis, thinking about the challenge of automation. And of course, now we can add the pandemic as another opportunity for thinking about the reset and how to build back better and fairer. And I've really enjoyed the sessions so far in the Congress that have been focusing on that. And that's going to be part of what we'll continue next year, because that recovery, that rebuilding is obviously a longer term process than just 2020, 2021, and will be well into 2022. So I'm going to introduce the panel in a moment. I'm just going to share my screen first. Is that okay? People see that? Beauty. So we've got a rather long title, which was even longer before we shortened it for our panel discussion this morning. So I was kind of looking at some of the recent past, as Jamie said, some of the context in and around the sort of social security settings, then what happened during the pandemic, which was challenging some of those assumptions. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the recent survey research in relation to public attitudes, and also in terms of some of the models that have been put forward in the context of the crisis. So I sort of stylized this on the spaghetti western in terms of our three parts. So I'm going to talk for only 5 or so minutes in relation to the pre-pandemic phase, which it's the fistful of dollars, and those fists were held fairly tightly in terms of conditionality. Elise is going to cover the section around thinking about the pandemic response and stimulus package. And it was obviously more than a few dollars. In fact, it was about $300 billion with a mix of wage subsidies and coronavirus supplements, which doubled the social security payments. And Elise has been looking at some of the impacts of that in terms of what it's meant for people's time, what it's meant for people's economic security. And then Ben and Troy, which are not the bad and the ugly, are going to look at some of the models, as I said, and think about what this means. And I guess the question that we're interested in posing towards the end is whether some of that rising public support that's been reflected in some recent surveys is path breaking, or whether it's temporary, and also what lies behind some of that sentiment. So we might get to explore that in the discussion. But first, to the kind of less rosy past, I guess. Australia, like many of the sort of so-called livable welfare states, it's a very targeted system. It's complex, it's categorical, it's paid for out of general revenue. It's difficult to negotiate, and there's a whole lot of kind of anomalies that have emerged because it was kind of designed in the 20th century, and it's really not fit for purpose for the 21st century, particularly the kind of discrepancies between what you get if you're on an age pension and what if you get when you're on the unemployment benefit, for example. It's also not very generous in terms of the unemployment benefit. In fact, a 2019 OECD study found that Australia sat right at the bottom of the countries in terms of the rate of unemployment benefit. There's been a marginal increase this year after lots of lobbying and post the coronavirus supplement. That's $50 a fortnight. And all that's done is lift us just up to number 2, just above Greece, in fact, in the OECD scale. So while we might do well at the Olympics, Jamie, we're not doing very well at the unemployment Olympics, we'd have to say. And as I said, there's been a long campaign about raising the rate, and everyone's fairly disappointed in where the government landed in terms of that increase this year. Just a coverage, again, this will be familiar to lots of people in terms of what the discourse is around social security in Australia. There's lots of ways in which the dependence on governments is problematised, lots of ways in which the markets for labour, for housing are promoted in terms of self-reliance. In terms of ethics, the paid work ethic trumps lots of other ethics that build social citizenship in terms of care and interdependence, eco-sustainability. And so productivism, is certainly dominant and reigns supreme, although there has been some cracks and some fissures in and around that. If you look at the pandemic, particularly around the sort of care work, both in terms of paid and unpaid, and the way in which that's been highlighted. Because I think what pandemics do, which is interesting, rather than change, is really what they do is kind of reveal. And they reveal lots of those inequalities and lots of those injustices, and that's certainly been the case in Australia. In terms of social security policy itself, there's been a real shift over the last 3 decades, gradually, away from sort of poverty relief as the aim of social security, much more towards labour force participation. Any job of any quality is really the key policy goal. There's also obviously that leads into employment services on the supply side and lots of managing behaviour through sticks. So the kind of upshot of all of that is that the burdens and benefits, because I think that's important when thinking about social justice and social security, are not very evenly distributed. And lots of those impacts are unevenly distributed in terms of particularly Indigenous people, which we'll talk about in a moment with the latest rounds of conditionality, but also young people, ethnic minorities, and people experiencing poor mental health. So that's the kind of sad state of social security pre-pandemic, really. And it's, as I said, it's been incremental change, but those settings have been there for at least 100 years. So this is some of the work that I've been doing, is looking at some of the more recent conditional welfare programs. And the sort of short message here is that there's been a lot of money spent. While other countries have been looking at basic income schemes and funding those trials, what Australia's been spending its money in terms of trials is on these highly ineffective and counterproductive conditional welfare programs. So in summary, what those programs do is quarantine 80% of people's payments onto a cashless debit card that can only be spent on food and other essentials and can't be spent on other discretionary items like alcohol, gambling or pornography. So there's ways in which that's fairly restricted, and only 20% of their social security payment goes into their usual bank account. And there's a whole lot of unintended consequences that come from this, which I'll talk about in a moment. It's also interesting from a mixed economy of welfare point of view. There's private companies that are benefiting very well from the introduction of this scheme. Government spends around $28 million each financial year on the trials, and the company that provides the cards in due gets an undisclosed amount in terms of that. And there's very little transparency around that cost. Just in terms of the per person cost of these trials, around $10,000 per person to administer. You compare that to an unemployment benefit, which costs the government about $15,000 per year. You can start to see how they'd be better off targeting their money by putting it in people's pockets. So that's the kind of scheme in itself. It affects around 37,000 Australians, predominantly Indigenous, and it started in the Northern Territory. So our own research, we've done surveys and we've done in-depth interviews with a couple of hundred people, 120 interviews. And again, this is not rocket science in terms of these findings. We find this with lots of these highly conditional welfare programs, which are quite different to conditional cash transfers, which tend to have incentives. Lots of these are, as I said, very tightly controlled and sanctioned. So there's very little capacity for people to be able to participate in the cash economy. So we have lots of examples and interviews about people not being able to pay for goods at stores that are cheaper because they don't take the card, not being able to give children money for school excursions. So these are the ways in which people on the card tend to pay a poverty premium. There's also a lot of stigma and shame attached to the card. It doesn't look the same as other debit cards, and there was lots of implementation problems when the scheme was first rolled out. So people tended to have a very high level of anxiety that the card wouldn't work, particularly when at the cash register. Social security is also based on principles of redress in terms of government provisioning. And in this case, there's been very few people that have been able to get exemption, and where these appeals are made, they tend to have to be making a case to a community panel that's nominated by the government, and there's very little transparency around any of those redress. So all in all, it's not, as I said, it's not good in terms of its outcomes, tends to be counterproductive and tends to produce more harms than good. And we put out a report that has been influential, at least in terms of the opposition parties, but has changed none of the mindset, at least, of the government in terms of backing away from these trials. They continue to roll them out. So I'm going to hand over to Elise in a moment in terms of talking about, as I said, a slightly cheerier picture of what happened during the pandemic, because some of these various forms of hard paternalism were suspended. But the message, as was indicating is that lots of these programs have been counterproductive, left people in poverty, also highly stigmatized. People who had no problem in terms of managing their money essentially were put on these cards. I think that, some of those lessons are around thinking about the importance of economic security and basic rights, and also in terms of security and risk being two sides of the same coin, particularly if we want people to participate in new forms of income generation, that fundamental level of economic security is really important. Hence, the people participating in this conference around one of the key features of a basic income. And of course, the other thing is that poverty isn't a problem of character, it reflects a lack of cash. And so the politics of misrecognition, at least in the Australian context, are just as important as the politics of redistribution when we're thinking about justice. Also, one of the other messages is that despite all of the research that's been done and all the advocacy that's been done, in a very broad-based coalition, is that it's had very little impact so far, at least on successive governments, both Labor and Liberal, in continuing with conditional welfare. I think the final point is about the voices, and that these people who are on the card tend to be very marginalised in terms of having their voice in these debates, in these policy communities. And I think that's incredibly important in terms of how we think about justice, but also in terms of the politics of time. And this gets into what the next stage of our panel discussion is what people did with their time. So that's just to end in terms of saying resistance did seem futile. And then along comes the global health pandemic, which reminds me in terms of the writing of some really great stuff that was coming out during the pandemic, and Aaron Dudley Roy in terms of thinking about the pandemic as a portal and as sort of possible gateway from one world to the next. And I think that is the way in which we need to think about pandemics, and obviously trying to use those opportunities and also getting beyond some of the language of crisis, because crisis can hold our attention for a moment, but it's not going to hold it forever. And I think that's where the advocacy and the continued effort becomes really important. So I'm going to hand back to Jamie and then to Elise to talk about what happened during the pandemic. So I'm just going to stop my screen sharing there.
That's excellent and a very powerful provocation around both that context. And I think there's a lot we can empathise with in other parts of the world as well in terms of that approach to social security and the counterproductive nature of it, but also to see where there hopefully is space for hope and opportunity. Elise, I'll pass over to you.
Excellent, thanks. Thanks very much, Jamie and Greg. And yeah, huge congratulations to everyone that's been involved in the current BN. It's been excellent, and yeah, huge congratulations. Big shoes to fill for next year. I just want to start by acknowledging that I'm calling in on the Ngunnawal land, the unceded land of the Ngunnawal, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And for our international colleagues, that is a really important thing to acknowledge. Sovereignty was never ceded in Australia, that there's a contest and a contested nature of sovereignty in Australia, which it plays into social security in a big way, because social security has been used again and again and again as a way to discipline, to punish and to assimilate, or attempts to assimilate First Nations people in Australia. And that'll be something I think that will come out more and more in the Congress next year, this sort of intersection between basic income and questions around coloniality. I think that is really alive in the Australian context. I want to reflect on some research that myself and some colleagues did when the first lot of lockdowns happened in Australia. So the federal and state governments have pursued a sort of a zero COVID transmission plan. So lockdowns have featured heavily in their way in which they've tried to deal with COVID. This research was with colleagues Susan Morey, Kay Cook and Kelly Bowie. So it was it's not representative research. It's an explorative study where we conducted a survey with when we were just trying to understand what was happening for people when the first round of measures were given out by government, which were really quite a shock, I think, to many of us in this social security space, because as Greg's already painted, it has been quite bleak for quite some time. And this government, this Conservative government that had for a very long time been talking about debt and deficit and sort of those kinds of, that kind of discourse around why social security needs to be at such a low rate, and such a harsh and with various harsh programs attached to it, did something really quite extraordinary and found a lot of cash, and implemented a massive wage subsidy program, free childcare for a part, and then also for some people on social security, not everybody, so non-citizens weren't eligible for this, and also not all people on all social security payments were not eligible for what I'm about to talk about, particularly people who were receiving disability payments, but there was still a large group of people who got an additional $550 a fortnight. It was called the coronavirus supplement, which was huge. For a long time, since 1994, social security payments have not been increased in real terms. And so to have this amount on top of what people were being paid was around about $40 a day, was, as you'll see shortly, really rather big. Suspension of mutual obligations also happened. There was changed eligibility criteria, which made it easier for people to access unemployment payments. And also claims were easier for people to access too. So online, the sort of Centrelink office that does a lot of the administration of the payments is a very hostile environment. And so because of lockdown, that everything sort of moved online. So these measures were seen, I think, by a lot of us, definitely myself, as a move towards a basic income, which was really quite extraordinary. So colleagues and I thought, all right, let's do a survey and to understand what was happening for people when they got these payments. So like I said, it's not a huge, it was not a representative study. I'm only going to talk about a small cohort of the bigger group that we surveyed. There was 146 people all up surveyed, and 92 people received the supplement. So like I said, not everyone on Centrelink payments got the supplement, and then 54 who did not. And this was important so we could compare people's responses, which I can talk about later if you want, but I won't go into a lot of detail here. There was a crossover, so not everyone that got the supplement has mutual obligations. So that's why I'm just focusing on the 38 people here who both got the supplement and had mutual obligations suspended, and to talk a little bit about what happened for them. And so you can see that most of these people had been receiving payments for over a year, so had experienced the social security system that Greg had talked about previously. Majority were receiving what was called job seeker, which is sort of just the general unemployment payments, but also people who were parenting payments, single parents, parenting payments. A lot of our interviewees were female, and also a lot of them had responsibilities for children. So when we asked people, we asked just really quite open-ended questions. We asked what was positive and negative about the supplement, and also about mutual obligation being suspended. This is what people said. So the first sort of theme that people talked about is an increase in financial security. So less stress and less financial stress. These quotes that you see on the screen it's just some of the responses that people were giving. Also, importantly, people talked about how the supplement got them to a space where they could meet basic needs. So they were able to buy things like food, medicine, pay the rent. Here the quote is being able to get medical and dental issues sorted out that I've had to forget about for literally years beforehand. Being able to buy new clothes for myself, not having to ration food and meds. Also, an improved psychological well-being. I also took up horse riding lessons. It changed my whole life. I've been happier and more able to cope with absolutely everything because of having a sport to participate in each week. It's made me feel like a good parent. And that was also another important thing, being a better support for children. So, being able to pay bills necessary, get things necessary for my children instead of getting a loan to make ends meet. Being able to give my family things we usually go without. Similar kinds of things were talked about when we asked what are the positives of the impact of suspending mutual obligation. But psychological health was a bit different in that people felt like they were not being hounded by Centrelink. So people talked about their psychological health improving also, but in a different way, in that that they weren't having to deal with the stigma and being hounded and harassed by Centrelink. So, no anxiety, no waiting to hear if I got an interview. I have PTSD because I'm a survivor of domestic violence. Anxiety is characteristic of PTSD, and the way Centrelink behaves is very much like my ex-husband. One day they want one thing, so you do it, then the next day the rules change and your whole existence is in question. So, the sort of triggering effect of the hostility, the hostile environment that Centrelink contributes to. And then also physical health, people talked about around the suspension of mutual obligations too. So being able to focus on getting healthy again without the constant hassle, harassment from mutual obligation. People also talked about their time not being wasted. So, no time wasting in meetings, less time wasting applying for a required number of jobs in fields that aren't relevant to me. And then the last sort of area that people talked about in terms of what was positive was having time for other things that were important. And this is interesting because people talked about being able to use the time and also the financial security, a bit more financial security, to be able to do things that help them prepare for engagement in the labour market, like studying, also looking for work. People talked about being able to take a step back and think about what they wanted to do with their lives, and just sort of time, not just in terms of minutes, but in terms of sort of the emotional time to sort of think through and work out what people wanted to do. But also the impact of suspending mutual obligations allowed people their time to do other social reproductive work that they were already doing, but it gave them took off the pressure a bit more. So, things of looking after kids, but other sort of collective good work like advocacy work, and people also talked about, being able to engage and help people in the community. So just to sort of, I should also say that we asked negatives too. So what was negative about the supplement? Overwhelmingly, people said nothing. Nothing followed by that it would end. And that's exactly what happened. So the payment was reduced quite dramatically by $300 a fortnight. So people then went down from getting $550 a fortnight to $250 a fortnight. And people talked about that being really, really difficult, that change, that people had to go back to rationing, and the worry, the stress started coming back in at that point. Then the government cut it completely, and people have found themselves in, a lot of people back under the poverty line. So, it was an extraordinary experiment, but it was a very harsh experiment that basically was pulled out underneath. All these gains that people were able to make was pulled out underneath their feet. And I guess the other interesting thing in terms of the politics is that not many people, the sort of public discourse didn't really flinch much when this happened, that there wasn't mass pushback around retaining these measures for people on social security, that the majority did, not much that came from people about that. But I mean, overall, what it does do is it shows how harsh the Australian social security settings are and have been, as Greg has talked about, and you just can see how these measures, these wasn't a universal basic income, but yet was definitely moving towards a basic income. How much of a difference that makes in people's lives, because people are treated so poorly in the current and before this happened, and it also shows what is possible when we move towards a basic income. I'll stop there, and thanks a lot.
Thanks. It's really powerful findings and sharing there, and I think for me it really shows that importance of the stories and the impact on people's lives that we can find in that as well. The quote about the indulgence, I remember we did work here in Scotland, talking to someone in Fife in Scotland who apologised to us and said, look, you don't need to use this in the report. But when we asked what would you do with basic income, she said, maybe every so often I'd buy a Chinese takeaway for my family on a Friday and we could eat together. And she saw it as something to be ashamed of rather than an empowering choice to make. And I think that's a really powerful space. And certainly as an outsider to Australia, very much looking forward to hearing and learning more about the First Nations people and the impact it has had there and that chance for emancipation. So we look forward to hearing more about that. Ben, I think we're passing over to you for the next contribution. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks very much. Sorry. Thanks very much. I'm going to share screen too. I just need to work out how to make this start playing from within the thing. There we go. That should work. Is that working, Greg? All good. Thanks very much. So I'm going to be talking through some of the discussions that we've started having in Australia around how we might actually move the system in a more inclusive basic income kind of direction. And I'm going to be drawing on some findings from a paper with a colleague, Ben Phillips at ANU, and also Troy Henderson, who's on with us now. And Troy is going to make some comments possibly at the end in our discussion as well. As we heard, before I start, I should say that I'm coming from Gadigal land, also unceded land here in Australia, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And as Ali said, that's one of the things we're going to have to think through very carefully here as part of the debate and also as part of our Congress next year, and something that we want to talk about as an issue of coloniality and post-coloniality generally across the world. Obviously all of us, no matter where we are dealing with a system that is going to interact quite profoundly with existing tax and welfare systems. We don't start from blank slates. And so a lot of what we've been trying to think of, a little bit similar to the discussions in the previous session with our colleagues from South Korea, is looking about kind of practical ways of moving the system forward. And Australia has, until recently, had a relatively utopian and not particularly grounded debate, where there was some really interesting ideas around what the basic income might mean, but it was dismissed pretty much out of hand by most of the main political actors as just being way too expensive and not something that could ever happen. So some of the research that's started to happen more recently, and particularly in the wake of COVID, has been looking at practical transformations, which now look a lot more practical, given the experience we did have with the COVID supplement that Elise was just talking about. So we have a system here, as Greg said, it's not entirely unique, but it's right up one end of at least the OECD experience of a welfare state and benefit payment systems. We have flat rate benefits. Our unemployment benefit is highly conditional, strictly means tested, and extremely stingy. It's one of the lowest in the developed world. We do have some more inclusive flat rate benefits. Almost all our benefits are flat rate for older people, for the age pension, and for families. And so some of the thinking has been, how could we build on those kinds of policy architectures? Thinking through what are the kind of practical steps you could take to move from where we are now to a different kind of basic income future. And we particularly wanted to think about the common criticisms that are levelled in the Australian political debate against basic income proposals. And they are mainly around the cost, how expensive it would be, but there's also a real culture in Australia, probably reflected by this widespread use of means tests, that under no circumstances should government money go to rich people. We have an extensive system of tax concessions, which it does that job instead, and is far, far more generous than any of the welfare systems that we have in place for most of us. But anyway, so we were looking at how we could do that. And we were focused, and when we were working on this, we were doing this before COVID hit. And so the systems I'm talking about are kind of pre-COVID systems. But what ended up happening was that the underlying principles we were talking about were in some ways taken up by the Conservative government with the COVID supplement. And so that provided some opportunities I'll talk about briefly at the end to engage in a public debate that opened up what an alternative world might look like, the kind of portal that Aaron Daddy-Roy and Greg were talking about just a moment ago. So we also particularly wanted to focus on the trade-offs that are involved in doing this, the fiscal trade-offs, so that is how much it costs, the distributional trade-offs, who gets what, and the incentive trade-offs. So a couple of these schemes have come up. I'm going to focus on the second of this. This is Australian basic income proposal that we've done some research on and modelling around. But also a livable income guarantee was proposed during the COVID crisis by a number of notable economists and social scientists, including Elise and Troy. And that actually got quite a bit of media attention as well. And it focused on a slightly less ambitious goal of easing conditionality. So still having some obligation in order to be able to get payments, but completely opening that up so that it could be caring for people, caring for country, volunteering, as well as the onerous looking for work and punitive arrangements that are associated with the system now. But I'm going to look at this model called, that we've called an Australian basic income, that seeks to get rid of conditionality and to integrate the system somewhere between a basic income and a negative income tax. It integrates the welfare system into the tax system. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this just gives you an idea of the thing that we're talking about. This is the proposal, so you know what I'm talking about when we go through the other stuff. These are just the tax rates in Australia on the left. And what this does is it has a basic payment. This is just modelled on the existing unemployment benefit. And it reduces the benefit withdrawal rate, that is the rate at which you lose a payment when you get work, so that integrates into the tax system and effectively becomes a single system where it first withdraws the benefit and then it integrates into the tax system. So technically this could be designed as a negative income tax or as a basic income with higher tax rates. And so we did some modelling of both the current payment, and we did some modelling of a payment that was a little bit higher. At the time we started doing this, the call was for a $50 increase in the unemployment benefit, $50 a week. As you heard, the COVID supplement was $550 a fortnight. So it was just wildly larger. So that was on top of the benefits that people had. Wildly larger. It only just got to the poverty line, but was wildly more optimistic than our welfare sector had been hoping for quite a long time. We modelled $75 a week extra which we're not suggesting is adequate, but at the time we did this seemed the only thing that was within political possibilities. COVID has changed that quite considerably. And what we did was we looked at the cost of it, but also the distributional effects. We did that just if it was all done by debt financing, and then we did that again with a fiscally neutral model that just assumed a proportionate tax response. So we didn't say exactly what the tax mix would be. We just said it wouldn't be progressive, it wouldn't be regressive, it would be strictly proportionate. That is, that everyone would pay in proportion to their incomes up to how much it cost. We thought that was a reasonable assumption to give you an idea of what was likely to happen in practice. And one of the interesting things is we have a system that is strictly means tested. And so you would think that a basic income might end up not being very progressive because those who are poorest already receive benefits, while it's people higher up the income scale who don't. But our findings, which actually surprised us, suggested that it was radically egalitarian. It would significantly reduce poverty and it would significantly redistribute income. And so to give a bit of a sense of the scale of the cost and of the impact, we compared it to other OECD countries. So you can see a series of examples here. The highlighted Australia ones are the base model, which is at the bottom, and the existing unemployment benefit and the slightly higher one, which are M1 and M2. And you can see the OECD average there. These are measured by Gini coefficient, which is a kind of normal way of measuring inequality. So overall inequality in a society, economic inequality in income. So Australia is a low tax country. It's also a high inequality country. What was really interesting for us was the increase in taxes that you'll see on the left-hand side only brings Australia to the OECD average. In both the models are roughly around the OECD average, but it radically reduces inequality from well above the OECD average to down with Sweden and Denmark amongst the most equal countries in the world. So we were surprised by that, to be honest, even though we're quite interested in basic income, we didn't think we'd have that radical an impact. And that suggests that this is quite an egalitarian reform if Australia were to pursue it. So wrapping up with a few of the implications. First of all, we showed that the cost of this, even though it's large, the cost of this scheme is roughly about 50 to 75% of the stimulus cost during the COVID period. So it's not astronomically high. As you could see, it is several points of GDP, which is a lot, but it does only take Australia to where other rich countries already are in tax to GDP ratios. So this, over the medium term, this is entirely a realistic policy pathway that could be trodden. It's much more redistributive than expected. And so it could do a lot of the heavy lifting of addressing the inequalities that have expanded rapidly in Australia since the period of neoliberalism. And I think one of the things we were looking at is talking about what are the elements of this. This is a kind of a full-blown model. We don't expect the government would go and do that all at once, but it might do bits of the model as stepping stones towards a basic income. And we thought it was important to be able to provide a kind of a pathway that had those sorts of steps that could be practically followed. So they would be to loosen means tests, to remove work tests, and to raise the rate, to raise the payment. And they're actually the exact bits that were included in the COVID supplement payment that you've just heard from Elise, which particularly got rid of, radically reduced the partner test. So we not only have a means test on how much you earn, we have a means test on how much your partner earns, and we have a separate means test on how much money you've got in the bank. And all of those things can knock you out of getting a payment. So the partner payment, the partner means test, and the assets means test were taken off or radically reduced during COVID. And that massively expanded the number of people who are able to access a payment. And I think that's really important because it gave an experience to millions of people of what this might mean in practice, of how their lives might be changed. Something that I think movements really can build on. And hopefully we'll have a similar experience to South Korea, which is when BN comes, it really will help ignite a debate and push that forward. And finally, we have now several different polls that were done during last year, and all of them show a significant shift in public support towards basic income and towards universalism that took place during that experience of the COVID supplement. And that has also seen one of the largest charities in Australia, Anglicare, now publicly come out in favour of something like a basic income. And so that does suggest there's now growing momentum. And just a little bit, this is some of that public debate from the paper that we managed to get in the kind of the broadsheet press. And that does suggest there is now an appetite to be talking about this in the Australian public, and something that we hope BN will really be able to ramp up for us and assist us in having that conversation. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Ben. And yeah, that's incredibly exciting findings there. And I think there is something around, you said about the surprise almost even as experience, you know, people involved in this field of the impact of it. We find similar in Scotland, that the potential impact on poverty and deprivation, on inequality and so on, it's huge. So a really exciting case to be able to make, and I think we're all very keen to do whatever we can to help support the great work you're all doing. Troy, I'm going to pass over to you to finish this section first, and then we'll move into questions and answers. So please use Hoover to share some thoughts, and we'll get those to the panel in a minute.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks so much for having us along to this panel and to the conference. Very, very disappointed, as you know, that I'm not there with you, going off on a tour of the Highlands or something like that. It's a very bitter blow for all of us stuck in lockdown in various parts of the world. I just want to quickly start by also acknowledging the Gadigal, Wangal and Bidjigal clans of the Darug tribe in southwest Sydney, where I am tonight, which is also really the epicenter of our current wave of COVID-19, and has really been bringing home the importance of the need of some type of permanent, reliable, quickly accessible basic income for so many of these essential service workers who live in these very multicultural areas in these parts of, you know, the city of 5 million people, who do not have the option of sitting at home and working from Zoom, who need to go to work, and if they can't go to work, need to be paid to stay at home. And I think that links into a couple of the points that really all of the speakers were making, but what particularly Ben mentioned towards the end of his presentation, this striking rise in public support for some type of basic income in Australia. And we all know, any basic income scholars know, that there are problems with the way that questions are framed in the survey research around basic income. But prior to 2021, Australia had no evidence at all as to the level of basic income support in Australia. We've now had 3 representative survey responses, all 3 showing majority support, starting off around the sort of 50 to 55% level, which I think was encouraging but not completely surprising to many of us at the beginning of 2020. But the most recent polling that Ben referred to, that was conducted by this major charitable and service provider organisation, Anglicare in Australia, that showed a 77% level of strong or some level of support for universal basic income after the concept was explained to people, which I have to be quite frank and say I found quite difficult to believe, because that's a higher level of support than even for public health insurance system, which is one of the most popular schemes in the country. So we could, of course, attribute some of that to the context that we're experiencing at the moment, and the large numbers of people who experience the type of income security that Greg and Elise have been studying in detail and increasingly through the pandemic. But nonetheless, it's encouraging for those of us interested in basic income scholarship and advocacy, and a good base on which to build as we move towards welcoming you all, hopefully in person, definitely online, to Australia next year for BN 2022.
Thanks, Troy. And yes, you certainly left us with a lot to think about, but a lot of it to be excited about as well. And I think certainly for me, it's a great insight into the progress that you have made over the past year and 2 years of really capturing that public interest. And as you say, it's now how we turn that into the reality of taking it forward. We're going to take some time now to share some questions and reflections with the panel. So please use, say, there's question and answer function and chat function in Hoover, and I'll pick up on some of those Sean's asked, when basic income is eventually enacted in Australasia, and I do love the fact it's an eventually, there's no holding back there. What's the importance of both Australia and New Zealand enacting it in close proximity to each other, given the issues discussed mirror those in the two countries? So I wondered, to what extent as well are those conversations taking place? Do you see that happening, kind of collaboratively, or is there a different trajectory there? No, I'll just open up to whoever wants to respond.
Can I jump in on that quickly, because I'm half Kiwi. My dad's a New Zealander, so I feel like I have the right to speak on this topic. No, probably others know more about it. And to date, I'd say there's not been too much interaction in terms of our policy debates specifically around this issue. But I think Ben might have at least done some work, or maybe Greg as well, that the New Zealand age pension system comes closer to a type of universal basic income. And there's some policy experience there, both in practical terms and in policy debates, that can be leveraged maybe to move that type of payment down towards another New Zealand cohort. Whereas, in some ways we have further to go. I'll leave my comments there.
It might be. It's useful probably for people who aren't from around here to know that there is a universal flat rate pension for age pension in New Zealand. So for people over the age of 65, there is a universal basic income for that age group in New Zealand already. The New Zealand government has been discussing kind of its response to COVID. It had some similar schemes to Australia, but it has been focusing much more on the job subsidy model. So it's currently talking about instituting a kind of unemployment insurance that's linked to a proportion of people's salary, actually very common in Europe, but hasn't been part of our traditions. And so most of it has been going there. And there's been a live debate with a number of scholars calling on the government to move more towards a basic income instead of that. So we'll have to see whether that will happen or not, particularly in a context where it's probably going to exclude casual workers. It's not necessarily the best way to respond to people who are in the most precarious situations.
I'll move on to the next question, so we can cover a few here. It was in the chat. It was a really interesting comment from Bob, reflecting at least on your description of unpaid childcare, advocacy, volunteer, and community work as productive work. And this is something that's come up quite a lot in a few of the sessions I've been involved in, the wider discussions. How do we redefine work? How do we see it as more than just paid employment? Susan's commented, perhaps we need that new definition of describing a job as something you derive income from and other meaningful activity as work. I wondered whether you could share from an Australian context, quite often we see that issue of, the fear that people will stop working, or that work is seen as kind of an essential component of success, or of a well-lived life being quite a strong cultural norm. I wondered whether you could maybe explore a little bit of that. Does that kind of new framing of work as wider activity and the job as the income, does that work within an Australian context, or do you find that there's kind of cultural responses around the role of work or the expectations of society around work and participation?
Who was that to?
Sorry, it was reflecting on your comments, Elise, but it's very much
open
to everybody. No, it's very much open to everybody.
Look, I mean, like employment is such a major feature of the sort of settler subjectivity in Australia. Like it is, how the deserving and undeserving is defined. It's such a marker of being a contributor to society. And of course, so within that, it's hugely problematic because, unpaid care labour plays such a fundamental role, as it does in economies everywhere, plays such a fundamental role keeping society going. But yet it is largely invisible, but hugely, of course, and I know it's problematic to sort of talk, but it is hugely productive. So I think, trying to push, and so Ben talked about the livable income guarantee. It does have some sort of piece of conditionality on it. but my sort of support was for it, because I do think that that norms around work need to be challenged, and so the Livable Income Guarantee was trying to get at that. And trying to redefine how we understood work. So, that contribution was defined extremely broadly and included all sorts of productive activities, but included all sorts of work that people are doing that is largely invisible. I should say too that in Australia, so there's an important feminist critique, but for a very long time, I mean, First Nations work is much more broader than what's defined as employment, and this has been a really important. A horrible politic, I think, for a long time, that First Nations people have been sort of written off as non-productive, but yet contribute hugely in terms of caring for country, the country that, settler society has built on top of, that has mined its land, mined people's land, put cows and sheep on people's land. It was fertile because of all the work that people were doing caring for country. So, but yet that's been rendered invisible. Caring of people. I mean, there's huge amounts of trauma. And so just the sheer endurance and survival, the amount of work that is put in by people to keep culture and language alive is extraordinary. So all of that work is completely written off. And people, if you look at the politics in Indigenous policy, there's this sort of discourse around closing the gap, and, employment parity is a major focus by government, and it's been implemented as a way. Punitive social security policies have been justified to close that gap, but yet they've completely overlooked the extraordinary amount of Indigenous work. So we've got sort of these two framings, I think, that are extremely important to stabilise that settler subjectivity of employment being such a foundational piece of people's contribution.
It's really powerful. I think, yes, that uncaptured, uncelebrated contribution that's made in so many different ways, I think is a huge part of it. We had a session a couple of days ago looking at that for carers in particular. And if the government was paying for what's being carried out by carers, it would probably bankrupt the country. We famously had a UK government minister say a couple of years ago, when someone asked about increasing the carers' support, he said, well, why would we pay for something that we currently get for free? And I think that summed up the attitude towards it very painfully. Greg, I think you wanted to come in.
I was only going to say that I think the other post-pandemic discussion has been about, less work being more fair. So the way in which some of the basic income discussions been joined to, and we'll talk about New Zealand before, but one of the things that the Prime Minister came out with there was trying to get a discussion going, get about 4-day working weeks. And, some of the law firms in New Zealand, for example, have trialled this, Sweden, nursing homes, and showing the productivity gains and so on, and less people taking sick days. So I think that, I think we need to think about these things as a package, in the same way the conference has been talking about universalism in terms of services, but also reduced working hours, and not forgetting that part of the labour movement. I mean, that was the promise of technological revolution in the middle of the last century that we still haven't got. We've got people who are doing more work on salaries, more hours, and we've got the paradox of underemployment of people who want more hours. So I think that we have to tackle that as well, and put those things in parallel to some extent in terms of those movements.
Absolutely. We're seeing that here as well. And the recent findings from Iceland around the 4-day working week is certainly being picked up by the Scottish Government as an area of interest. And yes, we haven't seen our hours drop. We haven't got our jetpacks either, so there's still a lot in the future we're waiting to see. There was a question asked around kind of funding models for basic income. Now, also you've touched on taxation and so on. So I just wanted to expand it out slightly and ask, have you started to look into other forms of revenue generation or contribution into this? So, for example, when we were looking at Scotland, we said, well, yes, of course, income tax and fair income tax is a critical part of any system, and clearly the Australian context shows there's space for that. But we were also talking about the possibilities of, data or land valuation. So I wonder, has there been any debate around, new revenue systems for the 21st century to go alongside a new social contract or new structure?
I might take that, at least initially. So yeah, there are a number of different models that have been explored, including wealth taxes and land taxes, which there's started to be research being done into. One of the limitations, I think, is the federated model in Australia places land taxes at the state level and income taxes and benefit systems at the federal level. And so would potentially require a lot more integration and coordination. One of the other elements that's possibly a big part of the funding model in Australia is those tax concessions, which essentially act a little bit like a wealth tax, because we do have a capital gains tax in Australia, but we have one that is absolutely shot through with holes. And closing those holes in the capital gains tax would raise, if completely done, would raise more than the fully funding of our high model in that last paper. And in the context of rapidly escalating house prices and, obviously like in many countries, a generation of younger people seeming to be locked out of the housing market, I think that's something that's getting a lot of traction and possibly is a little bit easier to advance, explain, and get up because it matches what's already there. It's closing a loophole rather than integrating a whole new tax system. But I think that land tax and wealth taxes in some form or another absolutely have to be part of the discussion.
Can I just jump in there very quickly, Jamie?
Yes, please do.
Yeah. Completely agree with them, but I just wanted to make the general point, and I think it ties in with the conference themes of going from idea to reality, and that in all of our various jurisdictions, whether you're working at a global, a European, a regional, a subnational level, there needs to be serious attention to the financing mix. And that might include a bit of deficit financing with some land taxation and some company tax, wealth taxation, income tax reform. Even the so-called regressive sales taxes can be used for progressive ends. And the basic income scholars can maybe sometimes get fixated on this simple solution of the perfect tax to basic income model, like sort of old style Georgias with the land tax, but tying it to UBI.
I'm going to ask a couple of linked questions that are about some of the approaches to some of the surveys and the work that you explored, and then kind of tie that into a question of my own, because I'm conscious as we start to move towards the end of this section. So Louisa had asked to Elise a methods question: how did you sample for the survey? And Nicholas wanted to know, Greg, in the survey that you talked about, why was there a mention of 87% of people that didn't feel benefits? Maybe talking about where the benefits are seen. And I just wanted to kind of tie into that. Obviously, a lot of discussions have been around pilots and experiments. Do we test this out? That seems to be changing a lot in different places. So, here in Scotland, where we see a government that's saying basic income's an idea whose time has come, that should be delivered if they could deliver it. In some ways, large-scale experiments feel like a way of slowing down that progress rather than speeding it up. So I wondered whether, in terms of the Australian context and looking at some of the work you've done, to what extent do you see large-scale experiments as having a role, small-scale experiments, or is it much more about public opinion and policy? So Greg and Elise, obviously some kind of more specific questions around your content there, and then just would be great to get your thoughts on that wider question.
You want to go first, Elise?
Yeah, just thanks very much for the question. So it was snowball sampling. So through a range of community organisations across most of the states in Australia, people responded, and also through social media. Of course, though, people who didn't have internet connection that didn't have access, and we didn't have many First Nations people respond either. So definitely not representative. Yeah, on the sort of, your sort of question, Jamie, just my immediate thought is, I feel like this, the supplement, these measures during COVID, you know, acted like an experiment. And like I sort of said, that people didn't blink when it was taken away. I mean, people who had those measures definitely felt it, but the public, you know, didn't really. So I just think, you know, my personal view around political strategy is trying to at least get these measures back and to keep pushing, but also to making a link to what Troy was talking about to what I was talking about, because I don't think people saw this as like, people weren't talking about this as a basic income or like a basic income. And I think there's some really important political work to join those dots. So people say, oh my God, right, we sort of kind of had one. Let's get it back. I think that's important political work.
So just in the specific question about the survey and the 13% of people that found some benefit, in the scheme and the way in which it's designed in Australia, you can volunteer to go on to compulsory income management. So you can volunteer yourself to be income managed by the department of 80% put on the card. For those people, they did see a benefit because they were putting the name forward. But the way in which the compulsory scheme works, it's by its postcode. So it's whole areas that get designated. So you'll have an area north of us here in Brisbane, Hervey Bay, Bundaberg. It's got about 3,500, 4,000 social security recipients under the age of 35 are all on the card. Now, lots of those people, vast majority, were managing their finances fine. They just didn't have enough cash. So for them to be told by the state as to how to manage, they resent, but it also incurs a whole lot of additional costs that I outlined. So there are a small minority that see benefits, but it tends to be the people that put their hand up and say, actually, I do want some assistance here in terms of budget discipline. And right now I'm going to need the state to help me with that. But for lots of others who didn't put their hand up, then they resent it and really don't see any benefit and would be much better off in a material sense, actually not being on the card. But just in terms of Lisa's point, look, I think experiments are great in terms of what they offer, but, you know, we've had that long discussion again, the basic income community, about that sort of yes, but no, in the way in which a trial is not necessarily going to be an ongoing commitment. The same way we have lots of innovative social policy programs in Australia that die out once the 3 years of funding ends. So I think that's always the risk with trials, but they do at least inspire the kind of moral imagination. If we do join up the dots in a way that Elise talked about, then I think we'd see it as far less threatening than we tend to in the sort of popular discourse about these kinds of schemes and the universal nature of them, because, you know, Australia isn't like the US. It is a kind of social democratic state. It doesn't see tax as a form of theft in the same way perhaps as some of those jurisdictions. So I think we can move away from a kind of low tax social democracy, which is one of the points Ben made in earlier work. We actually do like some of the ways in which we get access to universal health and universal education. We need to think about income in the same way, decouple income from labour to provide that economic floor.
Could I just very quickly add one more point that relates to Elisa's work, as a complementary study to the type of qualitative detail that Elise and her colleagues were able to put together. Ben Phillips, another one of the economists that Ben and I have worked with, working with some other economists, did scenario modelling showing basically that the policy intervention with the COVID supplement that doubled the unemployment benefit effectively reduced income poverty among that cohort of unemployment benefit recipients from 67% to 7%. So, you know, there is absolutely dramatic evidence of the effect of that policy intervention. Of course, as Elise was just talking about then, and I think Greg has as well, there was no political constituency formed in advance of that policy intervention. Therefore, it was very easy to take away.
Well, like, we're going to draw this section of the session to a close, but I want to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and experience this morning. And it really is an exciting space it feels to be moving into. We were all devastated when you had to postpone last year, but I think it feels there is a movement there. There is that progression that hopefully we can all help to contribute into and support with the work that you're doing. There was a question about when the dates will be for Congress next year. So I'm not sure whether that's at that stage yet, but obviously we will be looking to follow and connect in with you. And we'll make sure that, you know, delegates to this Congress have details shared with them about submitting papers, you know, dates to attend and everything else. So I want to thank you very much. I think this has been a fantastic opportunity. What I'd like to do is ask Mike Danson, who's co-chair of the local organising committee here in Scotland, just to take a couple of minutes and to kind of finish off this handover, and then we'll move into the papers that have been presented in the second part of this.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you so much, guys. And I say we're
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
So, Mike, can I invite you to take over just now, please?
Okay, thank you very much, and hopefully you can hear me in the bandwidth is fine. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to acknowledge the contribution of a couple of people without whom this Congress couldn't have taken place. The first is Ailsa Mackay, our late colleague and very good friend. After leaving school, Ailsa started work in the Department of Social Security, where she got so angry at what she was being asked to do with regard to clients' beneficiaries that she went to college and university, undertook an excellent degree, followed by one of the very first PhDs in the world on citizens' basic income. She became a professor of economics and really an intellectual power in Scotland and internationally. We've titled this conference, this Congress, Idea to Reality, and Ailsa was very important in introducing the idea of basic income and of gender budgeting to Scotland, to the Scottish Government, and to Nicola Sturgeon. If I remember back to the opening plenary, Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister for Scotland, came over as promoting the idea of basic income for this country. And that can be traced back to Ailsa. She was an advisor to the United Nations Development Programme, to national governments in Spain, Ireland, Canada, New Zealand, and many other organisations. She had many publications, frequent media appearances, and she always promoted basic income, gender equality, Scottish independence, and trade union rights. Together we worked on many of those issues and more, but she worked with many other people. Very sadly, Ailsa died in 2014 at the young age of 50. All of the obituaries stressed how much of an inspiration she was, especially in feminist economics, on basic income, and building a better world. One of the legacies was to establish an annual lecture series in her name, and the second lecture in that series was given by Philippe van Parijs, who of course is going to chair the final plenary in this Congress. She left many legacies, but in particular, she was key to establishing and furthering the basic income movement in Scotland and Basic Income Network Scotland, along with Annie Miller. So I also want to take this opportunity to talk a bit about Annie. Annie said she was inspired by Ailsa Mackay. Undoubtedly she was, but also I know from talking to Ailsa in those final months, she was also inspired by Annie. So we want to acknowledge her work. Annie's been researching, publishing, advocating for basic income over many years in Scotland, and well beyond, as people who've been to BN congresses will know. Her dedication, her commitment, her support to basic income, and for those interested in basic income have been exemplary. The intellectual rigor and the research in both of their works has been invaluable in promoting basic income to the mainstream. These two feminist economists have been key. So on behalf of Basic Income Network Scotland, the local organising committee, and if I may, participants at this Congress, I want to acknowledge and thank Ailsa Mackay and Annie Miller for their work towards building a better, fairer, and more sustainable Scotland, and a better, fairer, and more sustainable world. Thank you very much.
A very fitting tribute to both. We very much stand on the shoulders of the work that they've done to bring us to where we are today. So thank you for that. We're going to move into the second part of the session now, where we have two basic income activists from Australia who will be sharing some thinking. They've both prepared their presentations as videos, so we'll show those. First of all, we have Judith Willis, who is a PhD candidate at University. So we'll show her section, and then there'll be a chance to ask some questions, and then Paul Ross will be up after that with us. So if I could ask for the first video, Judith's video, to be started, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Where's the video?
The video is playing. Can you not see the video coming up there?
I can't hear any. I can hear your voice, but I can't hear the slide.
Right, no, there's no.
It's awkward.
So, running an online congress has been both wonderful and challenging.
My name's Judith Willis. I'm a social policy researcher, and I come from Melbourne in Australia. We are currently in the midst of a global pandemic. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, in his Nelson Mandela speech of July 2020, made the following comment. We have been brought to our knees by a microscopic virus. The pandemic has demonstrated the fragility of our world. It has laid bare risks we have ignored for decades: inadequate health systems, gaps in social protection, structural inequalities, environmental degradation, and the climate crisis. A changing world requires a new generation of social protection policies with new safety nets, including universal health coverage and the possibility of a universal basic income. At the time he was making that Nelson Mandela speech, we in Australia were undergoing a Royal Commission into aged care quality and safety. It was a very large review and took about 2.5 years. In consultation paper 2, the commissioners asked for public input into how to finance aged care services in the future. Some alternative approaches included a review of international methods of financing aged care. I suggested, as another alternative approach, that a policy of basic income could be an innovative method of financing aged care in the future. The findings of that Royal Commission were appalling. The interim report, titled rather strikingly Neglect, stated, Australia's aged care system is not worthy of our nation. Far too many people experience it as unkind, uncaring in its response to them, and indifferent to their needs. The Australian aged care system is unacceptable and unsustainable in its current form. The 3 main aged care programs operating currently in Australia are the Commonwealth Home Support Program, home care packages, and residential care facilities, previously known as nursing homes. I'm looking now at the number of persons in these different aged care programs disaggregated by sex in Australia, June 2020. The striking information, and it's in bold there, is that the female numbers were all more than the male and about double the amount, or double the numbers of males. That was for the care recipients in aged care. If you look now at the aged care workforce, once again, the Commission reported that the carers in the aged care workforce are predominantly women. And thirdly, if you look at data for informal unpaid carers, they too are predominantly women. Now that's the background of what we'll be looking at in regard to aged care. At this stage, we need to ask which model of basic income is under consideration in this presentation. Well, basic income is defined by Basic Income Earth Network, BN, as a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without means test or work requirement. The characteristics of a basic income, as defined by BN, are that it is periodic, paid at regular intervals, that it's a cash payment, that it's individual, that it's universal, paid to all, and unconditional, paid without a requirement to work. There are two additions I'd like to make to that definition. One, to ensure that children receive the same payment as an adult. It can be argued that children cost more than an adult, not less, as equivalence scales would indicate. The second amendment is that the suggestion that there be a component of unpaid labour in return for a secure and regular cash income. Each child, and possibly, and certainly every adult over a certain age, would contribute some labour to the local community according to ability and interest, perhaps within a given period of time. In a post-pandemic environment, if the stress of income insecurity were eliminated, it is possible that a culture of kindness and compassion may develop that would enable the reciprocity of unpaid labour to actually become the norm. It is suggested that the meaning and interpretation of the word conditional may change within a different social and cultural environment. In this respect, my suggested model of a basic income may be similar to Atkinson's participation income, except that it is based upon unpaid work instead of paid work or employment. Now, gender equality can be achieved also through income security. The UN Secretary General also stated in his July 2020 Nelson Mandela speech, and let's not forget another great source of inequality in our world, millennia of patriarchy. We live in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture. A model of basic income with a component of unpaid labour based upon the current global pattern of women's disproportionate share of unpaid work would begin to reverse Guterres's millennia of patriarchy. The following comments of Ailsa Mackay are also relevant. The focus on the world of paid work demonstrates a gender bias in that the life experiences of many women are largely ignored. Gender concerns have remained at the periphery, and any attempt to include women has been made without altering the analytical framework. Well, what would be the benefits to government revenue if we had a system of basic income? In 2018 to 19, the government funded about 80% of Australian aged care costs, and recipients funded the other 20%. The main sources of government revenue for aged care expenditure are taxes paid by employed individuals and businesses. Like many other developed and post-industrial nations, Australia has an ageing population. The proportion of people of traditional working age, who are the source of those income taxes, is decreasing, just as the number of people to be supported is increasing. Treasury's intergenerational reports have for some years expressed concern about forecasts of an increasing gap between tax revenues collected and expenditures. a basic income would transform the current welfare system and some aspects of the industrial relations system. Efficiencies gained should have financial benefits. Rigorous economic modelling and cost-benefit analyses are required. Well, what are the benefits for the consumers or recipients of care if we had a system of basic income operating in Australia? According to the Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety, fees and charges were one of the most common complaints. A basic income with an unpaid labour component may drive these fees and charges down. Assaults may be as high as 13 to 18% in residential aged care. Physical and chemical restraint, poor nutrition, unkind care were documented. Basic income may make it easier for staff who are undertrained, inadequate in number, and not suited for the job to transfer elsewhere, having retained their secure income. Basic income, particularly if it included an unpaid labour component, may tend to rein in high provider and high service provider charges. Basic income with an unpaid labour component may reduce costs for the Australian government. There may then be less pressure on the government to impose an aged care levy on care recipients and or the general population, or to generally raise taxes. What are the benefits for the aged care workforce if we had a basic income system in Australia? Well, aged care is one of the largest service industries in Australia. It is also a very labour-intensive service industry. Tasks are short-term and occur in different locations. Casual or part-time employees may be at call with no permanent roster, no sick leave, annual leave, compassionate leave, parental leave. There are complaints of no pay for travel time between jobs, of low wages, of no employer-sponsored training, and of multiple jobs. A basic income, on the contrary, provides all of those leave entitlements. Basic income will change the power relationship between an employer and employee. The employee can walk away from an abusive or underpaying boss. Employees or contractors with the financial security of a basic income would have the freedom to adjust hours of employment, as well as the type of job at different stages of the life course. There would be no need to accept a job just for economic survival if one had no interest and motivation in doing so. There's been a renewed interest in basic income in recent years, and particularly since the onset of the global pandemic. In February 2020, the World Bank Group, of which Australia is a member, issued its 337 pages book titled Exploring Universal Basic Income, a Guide to Navigating Concepts, Evidence and Practices. In May 2020, the International Association for Feminist Economics called for, in view of coronavirus, an immediate gender equitable universal basic income and the provision of essential services. The BN website reminds us that there is a basic income trial that's been confirmed in Wales, and that Los Angeles is the latest city in the US to announce the launch of a guaranteed income program. And we have heard of many other trials and pilots during this BN Congress. Well, in conclusion, how could basic income be a strategy for financing aged care in Australia? How could it be implemented? So Tony Atkinson asks us to imagine that one morning, some years in the future, you wake up to the sound of the radio news. The government has just announced the introduction of a basic income. You doze off to sleep and then suddenly reawake, having absorbed the news. How did we ever get to this situation? You ask yourself. Well, previously in Australia, barring a cataclysmic economic, natural, or nuclear disaster, it was difficult to imagine that we would wake up one morning to hear that a fully functional system of basic income for each child and adult had been introduced overnight. But suddenly, with a biological disaster, that is a real possibility. Australia has already developed a blueprint for implementing an innovative policy like basic income. That blueprint is the strategy that was used to roll out the National Disability Insurance Scheme across geographical regions of the nation from July 2016 onwards. The Australian government's ballooning costs of aged care within the context of an ageing population, plus the future impact of enormous stimulus pandemic payments, could well be the catalyst for turning the idea of a policy of basic income into a reality in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith, for that. What I'm going to suggest, if you're okay, Judith, is just because of timing where we are just now, we'll play Paul's video just now, and then there'll be a chance for any questions that people want to put to both of you. So again, for those who are there, please use the Whova function. You can ask questions, and we'll be able to bring those up for both Judith and Paul. So okay, you play Paul's video now, and then we'll come to questions after.
Welcome to this presentation on indirect slavery. My name is Paul Ross. Aren't we facing a culminating, exponentiating, perfect storm of socio, econo, enviro catastrophes? The socio, financial disempowerment, i.e. poverty, of which one subset is homelessness. Social disempowerment, i.e. stigmatisation and subsequently official harassment, particularly towards our unemployed. Both financial and social disempowerment catalyse mental illness, escapism, including suicide, domestic violence, etc. The econo, unemployment and underemployment. An ingrown economy that increasingly fails to exclusively produce and deliver the goods and services we desire. That is, it has become increasingly perverted by our desire to both create jobs and to fix or manage all the other problems, such that at least half of our economy is unnecessary. The enviro, the natural environment, including global warming, plastics in our waterways, habitat destruction, and the population plague. The international environment, particularly authoritarian illegitimates such as Xi Jinping and the Taliban. So, what do we want? If we had 3 wishes, we could use one each for our socio, econo, and enviro problems, or we could just ask for universal, sustainable stability, prosperity, maximisation. So, how can we achieve this vision? The universal, sustainable stability, prosperity, maximisation vision is achieved via the mission of maximising individuals' nationally contributive self-actualisation. Thus, the mission involves maximising that which Maslow identified as an individual's natural goal on both a nationwide and nationally contributive basis. And a prerequisite for this mission is Universal Empowerment Infrastructure, UEI. More shortly. So, how have we responded? Can't it be summed up as band-aiding? That is, haven't we been treating each C problem separately as if they are each causes? For instance, regarding the socio, we've tried to solve it with more social housing and mental health professionals. Regarding the econo, more jobs, 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 which may be referred to as Triple J politics. Regarding the enviro, 2050 carbon emission targets and sailing warships through the South China Sea. However, what if they are all just symptoms of a single supreme cause, which may be termed the mother of all our culminating, exponentiating perfect storm of socio-econo-enviro catastrophes? But what could this supreme cause be? Here we coin what we believe to be a new term: indirect slavery. Indirect slavery is the conditionalisation of receiving one's survival income. Even in the comparatively wealthy West, it is a major form of disempowerment. The question then becomes, where and how did indirect slavery emanate? Modern indirect slavery emanated from the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was characterised by community daily life merging to become national daily life. In this way, subsistence farmers who had direct control over their survival needs were encouraged off their farms to become factory machinists. Thus, unpaid work was replaced with paid work, which was compensated with money income, which, having two potential components, survival income and luxury income, could indirectly be used to respectively purchase survival needs and, if sufficient, luxury desires. Initially, machinists' families still occupied the farms, which meant if necessary they could go home. We've seen similar in, for example, India over the COVID crisis, when everything was shut down in the cities. A lot of people went home to their family farms. However, over generations, they and their families lost their farms and their subsistence farming skills. This particularly happened, of course, in the West. In this way, our ancestors lost control of their direct access to their survival needs, such that there manifested indirect slavery. So, how can indirect slavery be solved? Indirect slavery is solved by implementing the Universal Survival Income, USI, which is also known as the UBI. Ideally, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the USI should have been implemented as part of a new government citizen compact or covenant. However, there was no such narrative, so it didn't happen. The USI should be substituted for Universal Minimum Hourly Wages, UMHOW. This is crucial. Substituting the USI for Universal Minimum Hourly Wages provides something for everyone, including eradicating unemployment, which, though rarely articulated, is solely caused by UMHOW. The unemployed are defined as those who want paid work at the going wage rate, yet are unable to get it. It is self-funding, i.e., rather than being one-way welfare, it is two-way infrastructure, which generating resources means lower taxes. It's like a magic pudding, or universal education. Thus, the USI becomes a push eradicator, i.e., it eradicates poverty, unemployment, stigma and harassment, push, which counterintuitively increases the government's resources. Regarding the Industrial Revolution, in general, it precipitated a transition from community to nation, which meant there was a requirement for universal empowerment infrastructure, which consists of 5 cornerstones: universal rule of law, universal liberal democracy, universal healthcare, universal education, and the universal survival income, or USI. Please note, first, the lack of any one cornerstone compromises stability, which means authoritarian illegitimates can credibly claim, as they are doing, that the West system is flawed. Secondly, all 5 cornerstones are interrelated, such that the absence of one detracts from the integrity of each of the others. For example, no matter the quality of teaching, if students suffer poverty-induced family dysfunction, universal education will be non-optimal. Thirdly, rather than being costly one-way welfare band-aids, all UEI cornerstones are two-way self-funding investments. The UEI constitutes no less than Fukuyama's fabled end-of-history model, and therefore it is the antidote to Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. This has massive implications, including that the Taliban takeover occurred only because the West exported a compromised model. The Afghan people's greatest complaints against their former government were corruption, incompetence, and a lack of security. Yet the USI bypasses both corruption and incompetence because the money goes directly to the individual without the involvement of go-betweens. While the presenter has never visited Afghanistan, he has worked in Iraq, where there may be some similarities. To a typical subsistence Muslim Afghan farmer living in a small village, while democracy and girls' schooling may be important, demonstrably, it wasn't enough. However, if they and everyone they knew had been guaranteed a survival income of just $10 to $20 a month, it may well have been enough. As stated, the absence of one UEI cornerstone subtracts from all the others. Consider this. For nothing sustainable, apparently, the USA alone spent in excess of $2.26 trillion. Yet, with Afghanistan's adults numbering around 20 million, the USI, which in any case is self-funding, at $20 USD a month would require an investment of only 4.8 billion per year. Regarding Afghanistan, it was often said, there's no military solution, only a political one. However, perhaps the solution was full UEI governance. So what about the implications for countries such as South Africa, Lebanon, Cambodia, and Venezuela? Regarding the universal empowerment infrastructure's development, since the Industrial Revolution, despite the lack of a UEI narrative, in the West, all five cornerstones have, to a greater or lesser extent, evolved with the very notable exception of the USI. So, rather than development of the UEI taking place on the basis of a grand overarching narrative, it has, via struggle, bottom-up evolved. For instance, particularly in 18th century USA and France, democracy, via the struggle of the masses, evolved. Regarding the lingering problem of racism, by countries fully implementing the UEI, particularly the USI, it will predominantly be alleviated, as much of it currently results from an insidious downward spiraling conflation with poverty and disempowerment. Another notable point, of the Western countries, the USA possesses the weakest UEI, which explains why it's the one most heaving apart. Regarding the USI's failure to evolve, this is because it is being jointly blocked by an informal and unholy alliance between two otherwise conflicting forces. From the left, the how sentimentalists, who apparently don't realise the USI is a self-funding, exploitation eradicating and prosperity unleashing upgrade. From the right, the something for somethingists, who, as well as also failing to grasp its benefits, including to business, in addition, don't realise all inheritance, which has myriad forms including our culture, institutions, environment, etc., is something for nothing, and the USI is justifiable as an industrial revolution inheritance. Lastly, we will consider what effect the USI, as a solution against indirect slavery, will have on each of the socio-econo-enviro partitions. So, regarding the socio, poverty is eradicated. 2. Social judgment, including most official forms of stigmatisation and harassment, are also eradicated. Given poverty and social judgment are the parents of most mental illness, escapism, suicide, domestic violence, etc., the rest becomes manageable. Thus, it does appear to be a solution to most of our socio problems. Regarding the econo, with universal minimum hourly wages eradicated, unemployment, underemployment is eradicated, which means jobs, 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 or Triple J politics is also eradicated, i.e. there's no focus or no need to focus on creating jobs for jobs' sake paid work, which in turn means we will return the economy to being efficient, i.e. to exclusively producing and delivering the goods and services we desire, rather than being a means to put people into paid work. The current perversion means that though our potential productivity per person is around 10,000 times that of just prior to the Industrial Revolution, and more than twice that of 2010, most of the potential benefit is wasted. Other benefits include eradicating the welfare to work distortion. This is the disincentive for people to come off welfare and enter paid work because they lose that welfare. In the case of the USI, this doesn't occur. All but eradicating the manufactured mess paid work. The point is there is no longer a mess to fix, and much lower taxes. Regarding the environment, with the natural environment, instead of being forced to prioritise obtaining one's survival income, which trains the mind to be selfish and materialistic, one can prioritise the environment. Secondly, wastage and inefficiency, including by eradicating jobs for jobs' sake paid work and manage the manufactured mess paid work, are minimised. Thirdly, social status will become dependent not on materialism but on societal contribution. Lastly, regarding the international environment, when citizens of authoritarian illegitimate countries witness other countries with five cornerstone universal empowerment infrastructure, which is therefore inclusive of the USI, they will demand it for themselves, which will decisively undermine those regimes. Just before we wrap up, an aside. If, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, the USI had been relatively immediately implemented, then Marx wouldn't have seen indirect slavery's offspring, namely exploitation, which means he wouldn't have written the Communist Manifesto, which in turn means the entire world, our late 19th, 20th and current century's histories would be vastly different. For instance, as well as no Cold War, there would be no Red China, which means, among other things, no lab leak. In addition, our global population will be closer to 1 billion, as it was in 1804, rather than predominantly due to subsistence farmers needing to have large families for monopolised cheap labour and old age security. 7.9 billion and still rising as it is now. Concluding, our perfect storm of socio-econo-enviro catastrophes is entirely self-inflicted. This is tremendous news because, assuming it isn't already too late and provided we are sufficiently earnest, it means we can solve it. The solution is the five cornerstone UEI, particularly the universal survival income, which, directly solving indirect slavery, will also solve indirect slavery symptoms, i.e. our culminating, exponentiating socio-econo-enviro catastrophes to the point they become manageable. Lastly, this presentation provides the basis for a new philosophy called civilizationism, which will be outlined in a future presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul and Judith. I'm very conscious where we are with the time. I have to say, my day job at the RSA, we've always taken great pride in the fact that during the course of our history as fellows, we had both Adam Smith and Karl Marx, so it would slightly ruin our narrative if Marx hadn't existed at all. But we've got a couple of minutes just before we finish up. I'm conscious the next plenary session is kicking off on another channel. I haven't seen any questions yet on the Hoover, but if anyone wants to ask a question, you can raise your hand here and we'll be able to put that to Paul and Judith. Okay, I think you've both given a lot for people to ponder and reflect on. I think I'm correct in saying that if you go into the Whova channel for the Australian session, there are sub-sessions in there where you can rewatch the videos if you want to catch up on any of the information that was shared by Judith and Paul. I really appreciate both of you for putting the effort to bringing those together. I know it adds an extra complication instead of just being able to talk and present as you hear, so we really appreciate that. I'm going to ask to finish up now, just so we can move on to the next sessions. I want to say thanks to Lena, who's been working in the background, very much helping one of our fantastic volunteer team to help play the videos and take us along, and the Strathclyde Uni team, who's always been a fantastic support. I think clearly this entire session shows that we've had a huge amount of opportunity, and there's a huge amount of excitement to look ahead to with the Australian Congress next year. And here's hoping that there's opportunities for us to connect in person as well as across the internet. So please take care. Feel free to go join the next plenary session on coming to consensus and the definition of basic income, which is taking place on its relevant channel. And we'll look forward to seeing you hopefully later for the day 4 roundup for those of our colleagues who are still awake and not having to go to sleep on the other side of the world, where we'll start to bring this amazing Congress to a close. Thank you, everyone, and take care.